this important topic concerning the values, and in particular, according to my own theory, the diffused religion of values. Once again, I have to say that Durkheim's thought proves to be fertile and seminal for empirical research that takes place long after the author passing more than a century ago. According to Durkheim, morality is a set of principles or values that originate from the community, have been consolidated over time, and have been interjected into individuals through different forms of socialization, starting with the primary one in the family, of course. From this stage onwards, a continuum has been created with a common thread running through the entire existential cycle of the subjects, even if not always in a completely visible way. We could speak of a sort of caste phenomenon, which is active but does not become perceptible. Then there is another peculiar characteristic of values. They are an obligation perceived as desired and as such considered sacred. Consequently, values have much to do with religion, to the point of suggesting that they derive directly from it, so much so that they are connected to it. In more explicit terms, it seems legitimate to say that there would be a kind of religious morality or moral religion. It would therefore be difficult to establish a clear separation between morality and religion, or rather between religion and morality. After all, values in this case arise from a religious perspective, from a higher metaphysical level to which the sacredness of the group and the community is not extraneous. Indeed, it is quite intrinsic. Please scroll the text. Would you please scroll the text in order to follow what I'm saying?
Dear Professor,
you cannot.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Okay. I go on. Nor should it be forgotten that values also correspond to institutions, structures, rituals, myths, narrations, symbols, and people, which characterize the various moments of socialization processes, become part of everyday life and a sort of mental and behavioral habitus. The same happens with the religious beliefs. So the diffusive dynamics are similar and convergent, and what is more, they may have the same contents. The reinforcement of life's guiding principles occurs without interruption, especially in the infantile phase. Their implementation is comparable to that of a vaccine, which then also has its reminders, moments of reinvigoration, of a return to the predefined order, to the ranks, so to speak. It is often the celebrations, the solemnization of rites of passage, and collective liturgies that reaffirm the relevance of values, making them even more enduring and resilient. Among the principles with the greatest impact is certainly that of respect for the human person. This particular value is one of the most pervasive and can become even a typically secular feature, despite its likely religious origin. Just think of the concept, love your neighbor as yourself, notoriously of a Christian derivation and reflected in so-called golden rule of not doing to others what you would not want to do to yourself. In addition to primary socialization in the family, one can also think of secondary socialization in schools, where values can continue to be transmitted, emphasized, and cultivated to make the heritage of values built up earlier, starting from the first years of life, more solid and resilient. Durkheim's thinking has evolved over the years, of course. This is not the place to follow it in all its developments. It therefore seems more appropriate to focus on a precise moment in his academic career and on the historical period he lived in 1902, 1903, when he gave his course at the Sorbonne in Paris on moral education, on which we have 20 lectures written down in full as they were probably dictated in the classroom. From the very first lecture, his concern was clear. We decided to give our children in our state-supported schools a purely secular moral education. It is essential to understand that this means an education that is not derived from revealed religion, but rests exclusively on ideas, sentiments, and practice accountable to reason only. In short, a purely rationalistic education. A few years after Durkheim's course on morality, on 9 December 1905, a law was passed in France, sanctioning the separation of church and state, not exactly in an anti-religious key, because freedom of worship was guaranteed from the first article. Religious institutions were called cultic associations. Almost all the sacred buildings belonging to the state, departments, and municipal administration were made available for worship. Durkheim, who had a very particular and in some respect original way of thinking about morality, and who was endowed with a strong spirit of modernity and not detached from a purely scientific viewpoint, thus fulfilled his wish, at least in part. The essential nucleus of the French scholar's sociological vision is contained in the text of the first lecture in his course mentioned above. It is a few but intense pages full of reflections and considerations, which deserve to be reread to understand its deep meaning. In brief, and main points, at the beginning of human history, morality and religion went hand in hand, since the contents of one were not very distinguishable from those of the other and were reinforced by a reference to divinity that preside over everything. With the passing of these centuries and the advent of science, promoter of rationality, of course, the idea of a separation between the two spheres, moral and religious, became more widespread. But the absolute distinction between the two visions of reality risks, in Durkheim's view, reducing the relevance of morality, which is no longer supported by reference to the divine. What is needed then is a new push forward in search of other contents and different values that, leaving aside belief in God, can ensure the survival of society against the individualistic pressures that are adverse to morality. It is worth following more closely, step by step, the reasoning of Durkheim, who takes note of the fact that I quote, the secularizing has been in process for centuries. It has been said that primitive peoples had no morality. That was a historical error. There is no people without its morality. However, the morality of undeveloped societies is not ours. What characterizes them is that they are essentially religious. End of quotation. Thus, in terms far removed from us, there would have been a certain overlap between morality and religion, which was justified and consolidated by recourse to the divine being, to whom acts of worship considered obligatory were addressed. In practice, early morality and religion did not direct human beings' attention to their fellow human beings, but rather to a God, revered according to pre-established forms and handed down from one generation to the next over the centuries. The most numerous and important duties are not the duties of men toward other men, but of men toward his gods. The principal obligations are not to respect one's neighbor, to help him, to assist him, but to accomplish meticulously prescribed rites, to give to the gods what is their due, and even, if need be, to sacrifice oneself to their glory. End of quotation. The author's crucial consideration is quite clear. The objective of morality has been distorted since it does not concern people but a supernatural power toward which one turns one's gaze and performs liturgical services. The latter, then, are practiced with great care and meticulousness, since this is the very meaning of religion, at least in Cicero interpretation applied to the religious fact, which Durkheim seems to know and echo when he uses the expression meticulously, i.e., with precision. The philosopher and orator from Arpino, Cicero, wrote, "Those who, on the contrary, follow diligently, and as if they observe with care all that concerns the cult of the gods, are called religious by the Latin verb religere." It is precisely for this reason that, according to Durkheim, moral education could only be essentially religious, as was morality itself. Only religious notions could serve as the basis for an education that, before everything, had as its chief aim to teach man the manner in which he ought to behave toward religious beings. Way ahead of his time, the French scholar observed that, I quote, "although there are religious duties rights addressed only to divinity, the place they occupy and the importance attached to them continue to diminish. If reverence for God is reduced, it does not lose its moral role. In truth, Durkheim objects, moral discipline was instituted for the God, benefit, but for the benefit of men. This is precisely the point. Morality leads to the worship of God, but it is not oriented in favor of humanity in original times, of course. To this end, secular and rational education has been promoted, but it is not enough to expunge religious content, and it is not enough to remove the religious content. Instead, there must be a complete change of course aimed at overcoming the existing combination of morality and religion. This can be achieved by unearthing religious realities, certain moral elements to be remodeled and repurposed in a rational case. In short, Durkheim says, we need morality, but we need a religious morality too, even though the morality does concern God as in previous times. Nor should it be forgotten that morality carries with it an aura of sacredness. saved from religion, and because morality and religion together are perceived as emanation of divinity. If religion were to be separated from morality, the latter would suffer because it would no longer have its sacred character. To Durkheim, it seems appropriate to find a functional substitute for the divine in empirical reality. But he also saw the risk of depriving morality of its main source of legitimation. For this, it is not enough to cut out. We must replace. We must discover those moral forces that men, down to the present time, have conceived of only under the form of religious allegories. The remedy is to be found in symbols, to be used in socialization without mythological and theological mediation. But we also need other new tools, other ideas which are different from those of the past, together with the full awareness of being able to move towards other horizons. Not only that, we must aim to go beyond the private morality and the simple realization of peaceful exchanges, because this is not enough. The goal to be achieved is to set oneself an ideal through an industrious activity, all aimed at nourishing itself by having recourse to new sources. Thus, the moral education system has to be reformed from scratch, drawing also on some useful elements from the past and taking into account the changes that have taken place in meantime. It was Durkheim's conviction that morality could indeed be shared on a societal level, but in the last years of his life, he saw his illusions about the possibility of a cohesive society fall apart. Moreover, during the First World War, he was an absolute pacifist, unlike Simmel and Weber, deeply saddened by the death of his son in combat. The Sorbonne sociologist died soon afterwards. Morality is made up of norms, behavioral rules, ideals, values, representation of reality, and states of individual and collective consciousness that are translated into concrete and empirically more easily detectable acts, generally called customs, practice, and conduct. However, there is a tendency to distinguish what sociologists, and especially French ethnoanthropologists, call mœurs, i.e., ways of acting, feeling, and thinking that correspond to customs, habits, and models of behavior, considered socially and culturally acceptable. Philosophical, sociological, and speculative reflections on all this, in general, fall within the scope of ethics. The most problematic question concerns the foundation of morality and, in particular, its origin, which is attributed in turn to religion, reason, so-called natural law, and evolutionary psychophysical heredity. However, it is sociology that has a sort of primacy on the subject, following the great efforts of one of its founding fathers, the aforementioned Emile Durkheim, who, in his teaching entitled Morals and Sociology, sought to go beyond the speculative perspective and move on to both the interpretation of facts and the possible social application of the results of research. His interest in the problem of the transmission of moral content to the new generation was also not accidental. After all, the main idea was to constitute sociology as a moral guide for society, to respond to the challenges of anomie, lack of integration, and the consequence of development, with particular reference to the division of social labor, as you know. Another concern of Durkheim's was the maintenance of social order, the famous social order, cohesion and solidarity, which was greatly challenged by excessive individualism. It therefore aimed to recognize the value of respecting the individual from a collective perspective. His vague idea of a collective conscience was transformed into that of collective representations, the contents of which were beliefs and moral values, i.e., religion and morality together. Both of them were aimed at pursuing the objective of the common good, or better, our communion with others. This could also take place regardless of God, but giving importance to the community and its particular ways of acting. This led to a form of sacralization of the person and, in fact, of community living, a sacralization of society, of course. Durkheim project is made quite explicit in the above mentioned lectures of 1902-1903, which focus on sacred morality and are developed along three lines. First, the spirit of discipline, i.e., duty, attachment to social groups, i.e., second, self-denial, and third, autonomy of the will, i.e., freedom. Once the theoretical framework has been broadly and persuasively explained, Durkheim turns to the practical, operational aspects, with particular attention to the educational relationship with the child. In this context, the sociologist from Epinal moves along very concrete themes, with examples and solutions ranging from training to classroom discipline, from the influence of the environment to rewards, from the teaching of science to that of history. The theme of values brings with a considerable complexity, which concerns, as already examined, the contents of the definition, but then extends to the plurality of meanings that accompany it, starting obviously and primarily with diatribe on value judgments and the need for a non-evaluative sociological approach. Well, in this regard, it should be made clear that, especially in research on religiosity, it would be extremely misleading to let even the smallest interferences run their course. From the choice of the subject to the delimitation of the questions to be addressed, from the composition of the sample to the type of interviewers, from the number and characteristics of the researchers to the type of methods to be used. In this sense, every effort is mandatory to ensure the research team's marked heterogeneity of origin, ideological orientation, gender, age, and competence, regardless of the level of responsibility and the task to be performed by each member. It can be said that any possible presence of a pre-existing bias would certainly have been reduced, if not eliminated, thanks to the fact that in our, for instance, qualitative survey in Italy involving a total of 164 subjects, 80 people in 1917 were involved, including scholars, analysts, and surveyors, with a ratio of almost 2 to 1 between the number of respondents and the number of researchers in various capacities. Therefore, the diversity of the participants in the research work was such as to prevent the prevalence of an interpretative line due to the influence of any specific individual. In Durkheim's view, it is preferable to consider facts as objects to avoid both value judgments and prejudices. One can practice axiological neutrality, as Weber puts it, without condemning or approving, to understand the phenomenon under scrutiny better. However, it should not be forgotten that the scholar always has his own value relationship and is therefore likely to respond to this study interest, his idiosyncrasies, the values of its reference environment, and its basic orientations. It is also for this reason that in our research, space was given to the multi-method approach to mitigate the weight of personal choices, more or less conscious. The greatest attention was paid, however, to the values advocated, declared, and experienced by the interviewees. The subjects express opinions and perform actions according to their vision of reality, which to a large extent depends on the relationship with the values that govern the individual's social behavior. When people act at whatever level, they usually do so with an awareness of the advantages and disadvantages of their action. They tend, therefore, to be convinced of what they are doing, and they experience the relationship that is established between the desire for something and the object of that desire itself, which acquires value in its turn. In short, we go from the values that constantly accompany social actors to the values that attribute to what they aspire to obtain, possess, attain, and manage. If the researcher is obliged not to assert, it is precisely the case to use this word, his values, because he is obliged to respect the rules of science and his professional deontology, the other interlocutors, i.e. the real protagonists of every investigation, are quite obviously free to express value judgments all the time, weighing up the convenience or otherwise of saying and doing, thus making the sociologist's work of analysis possible. A respondent's attitudes and behavior are, however, dictated by basic values, precognition, norms, and habits. Above all, the declaration of a subject questioned in a completely free or guided way make it possible to grasp the links between different types of values, for example, political, economic, social, religious, and cultural context of belonging, as well as to establish what role the subject plays in a community or the larger society. This raises the question of the different values that can influence the individual. This may be value possessed and cultivated by individual or collective principles derived from constant and lifelong attendance at a group, association, organization, or church. But how can individual values be distinguished from collective ones? An adequate knowledge of the areas with which the interview is familiar is therefore necessary. There is a very close link between the religious dimension of values and values. And we have already seen, as we have already seen, it is a long-standing connection. Ancient societies took it for granted as a matter of routine without raising any problems. They give rise to communities that tended to be homogeneous with fairly homogeneous beliefs, behaviors, and rituals that were very similar to those of the past. In practice, values were to a large extent of a religious nature and had as a connecting point a deity or several gods. Most decisions were made based on religiously motivated assessments, which moreover had a strong dose of sacredness and respectability. With the advent of modernity and secularization, the connection between morality and religion went into crisis, which is why the essential values were no longer just religious by significantly differentiated. With the dissension disenchantment of the world, the previous spell was broken, and societies experienced greater stratification, starting with the division of labor. The communion of values was shattered, with the demands of industrial society prevailing. The values of the group to which they belonged were no longer able to withstand the new individual needs. There was a shift from community values to a greater personal autonomy. In this way, the same religious content no longer distinguished individuals who had previously been cohesive in their adherence to family, parental, friendship, and co-religionist groups. There has indeed been an erosion of religious values, but those who have resisted the trends and kept their previous traditions alive have not disappeared completely. It must be borne in mind that values cannot remain the same over millennia and centuries. Societies move on. Societies move on. Progress, change from generation to generation. New impulses come to the forefront of society and move the entire societal system to other places. Conflicts of values also arise within a religion, with supporters of the status quo and the advocates of change at all costs on opposing sides. The history of religions abounds with examples of splits that have originated from disputes over values, from Ashkenazis to Sephardim in the Jewish world, from Catholic to Protestant in the Christian sphere, from Sunnis to the Shiites in the Islamic context, and from Mahayana to Hinayana in Buddhist culture. In short, there are many realities in which we are witnessing a real war of the gods, as Weber put it, i.e., a very close confrontation between values and identities. To make Weber's thinking more specific, one can speak of values acting as gods of various orders, i.e., deities that give rise to a polytheism of values, the famous polytheism of values by Weber. The conflict between values increases more and more as society becomes more rationalized. Dualism concerns the contest between the ethics of principles of or conviction, an attitude typical of the religious person, and the ethic of responsibility, or taking responsibility for consequences, a mode typical of the political person. Without wishing to reopen the long-standing and debated question of the difference between religion as church and religiosity as sentiment of Zimmel memory, it is useful instead, at least in our case, to consider the concept of religion in a sense that is very similar to the idea of belief, and in particular to the fact of believing that there is something and that it has real consistency. Values have a bidirectional relationship with the religion or belief. They are a founding part of it and are influenced by it at the same time. Take, for example, the values most mentioned and appreciated by 164 respondents in our national research in Italy a few years ago. Family, respect, justice, solidarity, welcoming, and sharing. There are all concepts that it is not difficult to label as Durkheimians because they are peculiarly present in the works of the French sociologists. First of all, the idea of solidarity, which in some way also contemplates the other elements. Think of family solidarity, solidarity-based attention towards others, solidarity-based feelings of social justice for all, the spirit of generosity inherent in hospitality and generosity of sharing. The other values most often recalled in the interviews are work, sport, friendship, and honesty, which, in continuity with the main values mentioned above, confirm the altruistic propensity already present in the family: respect, justice, solidarity, welcoming, and sharing. Altruism is a sociological category that is, of course, Durkheimian, as well as Comte was the inventor of this specific category, as you know. After all, work is at the heart of everyday life on weekdays, just as sport is at the heart of everyday life on Sundays, while friendship and honesty merely reiterate the attitude of openness to relationships and consideration for one's interlocutors. It is hardly worth noting that these same values can also be found in religions other than the one that is most widespread in Italy, Catholicism, albeit with different attenuations or emphasis. This, however, supports the conjecture of the existence of a virtuous circle between religion and values, with constant interactive exchanges implemented through positive retroaction, i.e., reciprocal adaptation. From religion or belief that one then moves on to faith or belief in, emblematically represented by trust in God, which in turn produces a double effect concerning values, since it reinvigorates them and is consolidated by them. The process is completed by the externalization of religion, faith, and values in religious practice, a usual field of research for the sociology of religion, especially in the second half of the last century. To the same extent, another parallel development should be taken into account, which originates from morality, is reinforced to the repetitiveness of a customary behavior that is the moise mentioned by Montesquieu, and is expressed in participation in religious rites and other manifest acts of lived religiosity. The set of processes described as its internal organization that can be represented graphically in the figure below, in which the pair constituted by morality and religion acts as the source and matrix of the flow that reaches the mirrors, values, and faith, and then reverberates finally in the practice. As you can see, from morality to religion, from earth to values and faith, but morality, religion, earth, values, and faith are all connected. Please scroll on a bit down to continue. And finally, we have the practice. Okay, I conclude opinions on religion are varied among the interviewees participating in our national qualitative research in Italy. Some considered it to be the simple fruit of a family upbringing. I grew up in a religious family where I received certain teaching and I carry them on. But for others, it serves to explain something where science does not reach, or according to a more secular view, it has a typically cultural character to be valued positively as a useful social tool. For those who make their views known, religion is generally recognized as having certain importance. More than half of our Italian respondents, a total of 138 out of 164, attach great importance to religion, 72 out of 138. Others, on the other hand, consider it to be of negligible importance, 32 out of 138. And still, others deny an importance, 34 out of 138. In practice, there is a far-way split because the 32 people who did not express any opinion should be added. Thank you for your kind and generous attention.
Thanks, dear Professor Cipriani. Thanks for you. report, main report, our conference. Уважаемые коллеги, я прошу вас задать вопросы нашему уважаемому гостю. Dear Evgeny, translate me, please.